political reporter Victoria Churchill. Thank you so much for joining us, Victoria.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to be with you this evening.
You as well, thank you. And the main thing that led to Platner announcing he's dropping out of this race was after an ex-girlfriend accused him of sexual assault. What do we know about this accusation? What have we heard from that ex-girlfriend? And anything from Platner's team? Any denials on his part?
Absolutely. Well, so this woman, Jenny Rasico, she was the third ex-girlfriend to come forward. These allegations were the most graphic I think that we have heard in this whole saga. And then another ex-girlfriend who was also previously known, Lindsay Fifield, was also part of that CNN interview as well. So those were the two that had been named as people that had previous relationships with Platner and definitely saw a lot of warning signs in his behavior. And so Rasico and Fifield, and then there was also a third woman who I believe was previously identified as a Democrat as well. Their stories have been relayed through several media outlets over the last several weeks. And basically, I think what was the final straw is that these were very, very serious sexual assault, straight up allegations that, Democrats that had endorsed Platner from across the country had to go ahead and withdraw their endorsements. Particularly people like, for example, Congressman Ro Khanna of California was, somebody that was very vocal on the release of the Epstein files up here on Capitol Hill. And so, it would have been quite a glaring double standard if he would have continued to back Platner after these allegations came out. Other big names like Senator Bernie Sanders, he was one of the very, very early backers of Platner almost a year ago now, I think right around last Labor Day. So September of 2025 was when Bernie was campaigning with Platner in Maine. And it also took him nearly a day to withdraw that endorsement. That announcement from Senator Sanders being along the lines of, I've spoken with Graham and I've encouraged him to basically step aside and make this opportunity available for somebody else from Maine. Of course, your reporters brought up that they have a very tight timeline. Platner has announced that he's suspending his campaign. He still has to file the paperwork to formally withdraw. And then the party has a 2-week turnaround. So those big dates being next Monday, July 13th, for that official paperwork filing from Platner to leave the race. And then they've got 2 weeks until the 27th of July to actually have a new candidate to face off against Senator Susan Collins. And of course, important to note that Platner has denied all of the allegations, but he realizes that in the current climate that we are in, that it is best for him to step aside. This is very similar to the rhetoric that we saw from Eric Swalwell, who stepped aside from the California governor's race, as well as his office on Capitol Hill just a few weeks ago.
And in your reporting for the Daily Mail, you wrote that Platner ended his campaign after this latest sexual assault allegation added to the avalanche of prior controversies. So this certainly isn't his first time being in the public eye for negative reasons. Was him dropping out of the race maybe somewhat expected or not much of a surprise there on Capitol Hill, given this past avalanche of controversies, as you described it?
I mean, he continued to attract endorsements and donors, regardless of everything that had come out about him in the past. That was, sexist, racist, really, I think just some quite graphic things that he had written to people, the existence of an account that he had on an app that was known for, messaging minors in explicit ways. Those to me are all red flags, but apparently up until this most recent, most graphic allegation against Platner, that was not enough to be the final straw. And then, of course, we kind of saw the walls come crumbling around him earlier this week and throughout this week.
And as you mentioned, with Platner out of the Maine Senate race, the party has until July 27th to name a new nominee who will then face Republican Susan Collins come November. Can you give us an idea of what that process will look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Maine Democrat Party has stepped up. They are saying that they are going to hold a gathering of about 600 individuals that will pick that nominee. There's about four that have expressed interest or filed official paperwork. That includes, of course, the former Senate President Troy Jackson, who I think is ideologically one of the more aligned candidates with Platner. We've also got the Maine Secretary of State, Sheena Bellows, Nirav Shah, another former candidate, and then Jordan Wood, somebody that had run, I believe it was Maine's second congressional district. So they've got quite the field there. Candidates are already making their arguments to voters with their declaration speeches in front of voters and press. And of course, this is a race that's going to be very closely watched nationally. And Susan Collins is somebody that is a political survivor, I think, as she's been referred to a number of times in the past. She was out. I saw some videos on X of her over July 4th weekend jogging in a parade, which, at her age and the number of years that she spent in the Senate is quite impressive. Unlike some of her Senate colleagues that, may not be in the best health situations, she really does seem to be with it. I've talked to her on Capitol Hill, or I've seen her do gaggles with reporters as well, and she seems very smart and, obviously very capable because Mainers have reelected her to do this job time and time again. So, I think she's interested to see who she will face off. And of course, she has solid backing. And, even JD Vance was in her state a few weeks ago, and he recognizes that her independent streak is what that state needs.
Yeah, and this is a very crucial race with control of the Senate hanging in the balance. So with this last minute change on the Democratic side, could that affect how things turn out come November against Susan Collins? Is this worrying for the Democratic Party there in Maine?
I think Democrats are going to have a tough time coalescing around that nominee. I mean, there are, of course, states that still have to have primaries. In July, there's only, I believe, one week that primaries are happening, and then there's a slew of primaries that happen in August. So, in terms of the electoral timeline, there is still quite a few weeks left to go. And there are, like as I was mentioning, states that have examples of being able to coalesce voter support as well as donor dollars against these candidates that come in more towards the end of the cycle. But, at the same time, we are less than 4 weeks away from Election Day in November. Susan Collins, again, has a lot of backing, a lot of money. Republicans want to see her back in Washington, even though she, like I said, she does have an independent streak. Most times they need that vote, right? Because she can at least be trusted to vote with Republicans some part of the time, versus if they get a very progressive Democrat in that seat, that's going to be somebody that votes against every single Republican priority, even if Republicans do manage to hold control of the Senate.
And we will certainly be watching to see what comes of that. Last thing here, I want to ask you, in terms of Graham Platner's future, is this the end of his political career? Is there any way that he can come back from this? What is the consensus there on Capitol Hill?
I don't think anybody would invest time or money in supporting any candidacy of his in the future. I think a lot of people gave him some leeway. They went out on a limb for him. Again, some major names in the Democrat Party were willing to go out on a limb for somebody that was unvetted, untested, and I think frankly at the end of the day he let them down, and he let down the nearly 3/4 of Maine voters that went out and supported him in the primary. They put their trust in him, and he did not reciprocate that trust. So I think that this is the end of his political careers and ambitions.
All right, thank you so much, Victoria Churchill with the Daily Mail. We really appreciate your insight here on Live Now from Fox.
Thanks so much for having me. Let's do it again soon.
We will.